Washington, D.C. has always been a strange place, deeply important to the nation, full of monuments, symbols, and famous politicians, but also home to a lot of people who go to school, shop, and attend church just like people everywhere. One of those churches is All Souls, Washington, a Unitarian Universalist church. All Souls was founded as First Unitarian Church of Washington in 1821. John Quincy Adams, John C. Calhoun, and Charles Bulfinch were among the church's founding members. We have some slides, perhaps. Unitarianism was practically the regional faith of the New England, but had very little presence in the nation south of New York City until the 20th century. Washington, D.C., a city where slavery was legal, was quite a stretch for that very northern denomination, and the majority of the early First Unitarian congregation sympathized with the southern attitude to slavery. Many of the church's ministers, on the other hand, were New Englanders and vocal abolitionists. The church bell, cast in 1822 by Joseph Revere, the son of Paul Revere, and funded in part by President James Monroe, had long been used for public purposes such as announcing fires and public meetings. But when in 1861 the church told the bell to mourn the execution of John Brown, the city government denounced it as the abolition bell and discontinued using it for public purposes. All Souls Church has had 3 buildings during its nearly 200 years, and the bell has moved with the congregation and is still rung on Sunday mornings. During the Civil War, the church building was used as a military hospital while worship services were held in the Senate chambers. After the Civil War, the congregation moved to a new building and officially changed its name to All Souls Church. The church was fortunate to enjoy an extremely long ministry in the 20th century, from 1901 to 1943, and during that time grew to need its current building. William Howard Taft, a frequent worshiper at All Souls, laid the cornerstone. Mid-century All Souls minister was the Reverend A. Powell Davies, who quickly gained a reputation for his strong sermons about civil rights and women's rights, and in opposition to the political movement called McCarthyism. His sermons were accepted on Monday mornings in the Washington Post. Davis was a remarkable leader who was in a remarkable place and time. In a sermon in 1953, Reverend Davies pledged himself and invited members of the congregation to join him in refusing to patronize restaurants and places of entertainment that refused entrance to African Americans. A list of non-segregated establishments was compiled, and congregants distributed more than 40,000 copies throughout the Washington area. That was a year before Brown versus the Board of Education. Davis also had an innovative approach to church growth. Instead of buying yet another larger building, he expanded the reach of Unitarian Universalism through the use of branch congregations, which joined worship through a phone hookup. Most of the congregations so founded became independent. I grew in one of those suburban churches and have more than a few of you. Dr. Davies died of a heart attack in 1957. Washington has changed, grown, and developed more boundaries between church and state since then. The congregation has had its ups and downs since 1957 and is currently in a very strong and healthy place. When Washington, D.C. passed a Fair Marriage Act, the legislation was signed at All Souls Church.
I hope those slides are working for me. We Unitarian Universalists do not have saints. It goes against our prophethood of all believers faith. But we do have heroes and heroine of faith that defined who we are, prodded us into what we could be, and stood on the right side of history. The Unitarians produced the trinity of William Ellery Channing, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Theodore Parker. The Universalists produced the likes of John Murray and Olympia Brown, historical figures to some, but saint-like figures to others. More recently, The Reverend James Reeb has entered that pantheon. In my home state of Wisconsin, there is a church named after James Reeb, and many UU churches across the country have James Reeb rooms and plaques. Reeb was born in 1927, raised as a devout Presbyterian in Kansas and Wyoming. Feeling the call to ministry, he graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary. And in the 1950s, he worked as a chaplain. But Presbyterianism soon stopped working for him, and he started to explore the humanism of Unitarian Universalism. After a few years as assistant minister at the prestigious All Souls UU Church in Washington, D.C., he took a pay cut to become the director of a Quaker-run low-income housing program in a predominantly African-American neighborhood in Boston. Reeb saw his work with the poor as a religious calling. He not only worked in that poor neighborhood, but lived there with his wife and 4 kids. This was, of course, the time and at the height of the civil rights movement. In early 1965, Selma was the epicenter. In February of that year, 500 school children and Martin Luther King Jr. were arrested. February 18th, a 26-year-old man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot and killed by a state trooper during a peaceful protest for voting rights. Marching for voting rights and in the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson, on March 7th, protesters were violently attacked on the bridge leaving Selma, which was caught on live video for the nation to see. Martin Luther King Jr. soon put a call to clergy across the nation to stand in solidarity with him and the people of Selma. 450 clergy came in the next 2 days, over 100 of which were Unitarian Universalist ministers. James Reeb was one of them. On March 9th, James Reeb, with hundreds of other clergy, marched to that same bridge and prayed, and then came back to the town. James Reeb and 2 other ministers went to a diner in a black part of town. After eating and talking with their wives, they walked out of that diner and were approached by 4 white men, one carrying a club or a pipe. They said to themselves to just keep walking, but were soon attacked, and the man wielding that club struck Reeb on the head. Because of a number of mishaps, including the ambulance getting a flat tire, it took several hours for Reeb to get to a hospital that actually could help him. 2 days later, Reeb was pronounced dead at the age of 38. Reeb's death prompted national horror and grief. President Lyndon Johnson arranged for a plane to pick up his wife and father. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his eulogy. President Johnson evoked Reeb before he addressed the nation and called on Congress for the passage of a voting rights bill. Thousands more came to Selma to march. August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which eliminated poll tax and reading requirements. In the following election, black candidates were elected across the South. Reeb's death seemed to awaken in white America the level of violence blacks were living with for centuries. James Reeb, Selma, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 are all watershed moments for America and our religious movement. Though many blacks had died at the hands of white segregationists in the South, it took a white northern minister to be slain for the racist and segregated nation to wake up and see the evil that was taking place. Reeb used his place of white, educated, male, ordained privilege to to face off against injustice and evil. A UU minister once told me 90% of ministry is showing up. The Reverend James Joseph Reeb, saint, martyr, minister, and hero of our faith, indeed showed up and paid the ultimate price for it.
Now we're going to sing together again, another song used to strengthen and encourage people in the civil rights movement. I invite you to rise in body or in voice, and let's sing "We Shall Overcome" together. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall hand in hand someday. We shall be free. We shall be free. We shall be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall all be free someday. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall live in peace someday. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Please be seated.
We leave the national scene now and swirl our telling of history down to this place and this church. In 2001, even before 9/11, this church was in a jam. We'd finished the building project, the one that produced the RE building and the office, and the rigors of the project had taken a toll on our morale. The board and I were at somewhat of an impasse about how staff should be managed. The DRE had quit, and there was a lot of scapegoating energy in the air. It was a low point in my ministry here. A small group was commissioned by the board to figure out what could be done. Dan Small chaired the group, as I remember, and their conclusion was that the staff needed to be managed by one person, a minister, and that if the board was not willing for me to be that person, they should bring on a second minister as an executive minister, focusing more on the business side of the church. The church, then 5/8 the size of our church today, could afford that if it spent down its entire cash reserve over 3 years and simultaneously doubled its pledging. I remember Dan calling me to ask me if I was agreeable with this. Sure, I said, and privately I thought, they'll never vote for it, they won't be able to raise the funds, and nobody qualified will apply for this job. Then I went on sabbatical, which, as you can tell from the foregoing, I needed. By the time I returned, the congregation had gathered its courage, and I mean really, using all the reserves and doubling the pledge income, and they had voted for this plan and decided to do it. And by that time, I'd been contacted by a colleague friend who I thought could probably pull off the job description. 6 months later, Jim Zacharias joined the staff as our interim associate minister. I had known Jim since my youth. Growing up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., I was aware that there was a very cool associate minister doing wild and scary things like psychodrama with his youth group downtown at All Souls. I never got the nerve to go, but I remembered his name, and later that minister was in the Mountain Desert District and a colleague of mine, and we struck up an acquaintance. It's a small world, after all. His job in Albuquerque, which he accepted with gusto, was to create the space in all of our one-minister systems and habits for a second minister and pave the way for a permanent associate minister. His background was mostly in pastoral and family counseling, and he was very attuned to the problematic matters of communication, bad feelings from the past, and other systemic issues we had going on, and he set about getting people to talk to each other and get over it. The church he left 2 years later was healthier and happier, and beginning what would become a tremendous growth spurt. The senior minister was healthier and happier and excited about her work again. It was a very successful interim ministry. Last spring, I realized that Jim was, this fall, going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of his ordination. This is a pretty big deal in the ministerial world. There are rarely only more than 5 or 6 ministers celebrating their 50th year among the colleagues at GA each year. Knowing that Jim began in ministry under very dramatic circumstances, I asked him if he would tell the congregation about his first ministry so that we could celebrate his 50 years with him, and thus our service this morning. Jim.
Wow, what 10 years will bring. This is an incredible sanctuary and a wonderful opportunity to reconnect with you. The mid-60s was a time of turbulence throughout our country. And in our nation's capital, social unrest was even more intense. And this is where I arrived as a young, under 30, first-time minister ready to make a difference in the world and to experience my new position and environs. After driving from Denver, I arrived at All Souls Church one September afternoon with a homemade fiberglass canoe strapped to the top of my car. I was rather naive, and I was totally unaware of the challenges that were facing me. All Souls was a fully integrated 1,100-member congregation, almost equally African American and white. Duncan Hallett was a senior minister, and following Jim Reeves' departure, they needed a new assistant minister. I had met with the search committee that spring, the previous spring. Duncan Hallett was not there. He was traveling in Europe, so I did not meet him until I arrived in September. So not only was I to begin my first ministry without meeting my senior minister, I was also about to begin my first ministry without the benefit of a supervised internship. And as you can imagine, this is not the best way to begin a new job. But some things have changed. No one enters UU ministry now without a supervised internship, but some things still remain the same. Better meet your senior minister before you begin a new job. Within a few months of my arrival, the church ordained me. Dana Greeley, the first president of the UUA merger, which had occurred 3 years before, participated in the ceremony, and it was a true celebration. As a new minister, one of my tasks was to work with the teens, and they quickly dominated my time. Once these young people learned that I was experienced in using psychodrama, a group experience where you utilize techniques like role reversal and mirroring, I was asked on numerous occasions to lead workshops at their youth retreats. And on many occasions, I worked with 100 kids at a time. In these sessions, the teens would act out their frustrations while their peers would play roles of parents, other adults, or teens with whom they had conflict. And then in addition, every Sunday at the church, I worked with 50 middle school and high school students, creating programs relevant to their needs and assisting them in developing their own worship services. With the civil rights movement heating up, I accompanied 6 of these high school students to the Deep South, where I joined the March on Selma, led by Martin Luther King Jr., a memorable and sobering experience. As a new minister, I found myself performing many weddings, including interracial ones. Interracial marriage had been legalized in D.C. before my arrival and was to be legalized on the federal level a few years later, but it was still illegal in Virginia. So couples came to D.C. to be married. I quickly became known as Marrying Sam and often conducted 4 to 6 weddings in a weekend. These were happy occasions despite the occasional mix-up I had with the names during a marathon wedding weekend. Some things have changed. Interracial couples are now all around us, including in the media. A 2013 Gallup poll found that 87% of Americans approve of marriage between blacks and whites. But some things remain the same. Performing 6 weddings on a weekend will still lead to slip-ups. In order to get to know what was happening in this thriving congregation, I attended as many committee meetings as I could. One evening, I walked into the church library and sat down at my third committee meeting of the evening. This was the Unitarian Players Group, and they were going to put on the play, "Oh, Dad, poor Dad, Mama's hung you in the closet, and I'm feeling so sad." They had assigned all the roles, except Dad. Desperate, they turned to me. "I'll do it if there are no lines," I said. Little did I know what I had agreed to do. In 2 days' time, I'd learned to fall stiffly from my ankles. I played the dead man's role very well. It was a good play and great fun. All Souls was like many large and vibrant congregations, but their DC location created many unique experiences for me. One morning I was in my office and the chaplain of the Air Force called. Without fanfare, he said, "Adlai Stevenson's body will arrive at Andrews Air Force Base this afternoon, and I will pick you up at 1 o'clock. I knew that Adlai Stevenson was a UU. And I also deducted that my presence there was to be part of the clergy contingent to meet the body, to meet the caisson. And so I didn't ask any questions, and I showed up at the front door of the church when the limousine arrived. Adlai Stevenson was a noted statesman. He had run on 2 occasions for president against Eisenhower. And under Kennedy, he served as the 5th UN ambassador. And that day, I was only 20 feet away from President Lyndon Johnson as he greeted the family. Later, when Stevenson's caisson was placed at the Washington Cathedral for viewing, I walked past the caisson and met, and shook hands and greeted Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president. And what I remember most about that experience was the aura that surrounded him. Humphrey had attended the memorial service we had for James Reed. Though I had been hired to replace Jim, I had not totally felt his shadow for the first 6 months of my ministry at All Souls. But my ministry was to change dramatically after his assassination. He was well enough liked at All Souls, and though he was appreciated, his ministry was not considered exceptional. Upon his death, however, his shoes were suddenly much larger to fill, and I felt the comparison more acutely than ever before. Jim had now achieved the level of sainthood. In addition, Duncan was asked to write Jim's autobiography, No Greater Love. He took a sabbatical to live at his summer home in Maine, and I was left to run the church. Now, only less than a year into my first ministry, I was over my head, and what that meant was that I had to make difficult decisions. So I would make decisions in the morning that Duncan in the afternoon would reverse by phone. This was one of the most challenging years of my life. Duncan and I admittedly had different ideas of how to run a church, especially given the changing world in which we lived and the generations that defined us. For example, though the UUA was progressive in many areas, including civil rights, gay rights was largely ignored. In the 1950s and 60s, Americans faced a legal system that was extremely hostile, except for occasional bars whose owners and managers were likely gay. Few establishments welcomed them. One afternoon during Duncan's sabbatical, a young man representing the Mattachine Society, a group founded in the 50s to promote the rights of homosexual men, appeared in my office. He appeared because he was hopeful that the church would provide a space for their group to meet. I wanted to support them, so I offered them a space on a continuing basis. Duncan was not happy. Some things have changed. We can now be proud of the progressive stance that the UUs have taken on gay rights. But some things remain the same. Supervisors and employees need clear agreements in order to know how they're going to work together. For me, one of the most challenging responsibilities of parish ministry is the weekly sermon. So during Halle's sabbatical, fortunately, Sunday morning speakers had been lined up to bridge the gap. It was my duty to greet them and conduct the Sunday service. These people were often well-known and impressive people. One person in particular who spoke was Whitney Young. He was a civil rights worker and executive director of the Urban League. I can remember sitting behind the pulpit, listening to the organ prelude before the service started, and he asked to see my reading for the day. Apparently, he considered it insufficient introduction to his sermon, so he began to write. And then he presented me with a new reading in his own words to share with the congregation. His ability to write a thoughtful, cogent reading off the cuff was impressive. I spent 3 years at All Souls Learning Ministry. I became a minister by immersion. It was birthed by fire. I went on to do the kind of ministry that suited me, that of community minister as a pastoral counselor and couples and family therapist. After leaving All Souls, I continued to work in D.C., immersed in a clinical training program designed to strengthen pastoral skills. Now, some things have changed. This clinical training, or CPE, is now required prior to one's first ministry. But some things remain the same. There are ministers who are more suited to ministries other than parish. In April of 1968, I returned home from a whitewater canoeing weekend and found myself confronted at the D.C. border by the National Guard. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Riots had torn through D.C., and the shopping center that I used just 2 blocks from the church had gone up in flames and was gutted. The apartment complex where I lived for 3 years was multiracial, and following the riots, it became essentially black. Just 2 short months later, Bobby Kennedy was killed while campaigning for president. These were difficult times. Having completed my training in D.C., I moved to Seattle, where I directed the Unitarian Counseling Service. After 16 years in this capacity, I moved to South Texas, where I directed the Samaritan Counseling Service, a franchise agency that has centers throughout the country. Then prior to coming to Albuquerque, I taught at the University of Denver with new counselors where I taught them the use of sex therapy and couples therapy. And while in the office of our UU district exec in Denver in 2002, she told me that Albuquerque was looking for an interim associate and to create a second ministerial position. In addition to teaching counseling at the same time in Denver, I was also teaching at one of the seminaries. And in addition to teaching them the students counseling skills, I taught these students ways to create create change and resolve conflict, and promote health within a congregation. Albuquerque seemed like a perfect opportunity to practice what I'd been teaching to these young seminarians, so I applied for the position, hoping to effect positive change using the skills I had been teaching. Vance, who was chair of the search committee, along with other members of the committee at the time, will remember our first phone interview. Unlike my first search committee interview, where the committee asked all the questions, I chose to interview the members of this committee. The interaction that we had was really, it flowed, and it was a learning experience for all of us. Unfortunately, Christine, the senior minister, was present and part of the search committee. These 2 years with you were challenging, intense, and yet ultimately extremely rewarding. There were no models for what we were doing. Very few churches had chosen the path we were forging. We were essentially on our own, and as trying as the work was for us, we listened to each other and we worked together. I recognized the desire you had to become a large and vibrant congregation, not necessarily perfect, but accepting of idiosyncrasies, much like a family. And it was evident that you had the resources to make it happen. As I close, I want to acknowledge my pleasure in having been part of the growth and healing that exists in this congregation. Healthy congregations revolve over time. In the process, they demonstrate effective ways of meeting the needs of their members and provide a safe place to create and sustain community. And for this, you can feel duly proud.
Stay up here with me. Oh, look at this. Wow. Well, we've swirled around in the winds of history this morning, the history of a nation, of a movement, of two churches, of one minister. The one minister is perhaps the least important. After all, any one person is but a blip on the screen of history. But one minister is also the most important, for the world's screen is made up of the actions and passions that each of us bring to and make of our lives. Jim, I want to congratulate you on completing half a century of work in ministry. And you know that Jim is still working part-time as a counselor, so his career isn't over yet. But 50 years of caring about people, about congregations, about colleagues. It's made the world around you a better place. Thank you, especially for the 2 pivotal years you spent here in the First Unitarian Church of Albuquerque. Its current vitality is, in part, a gift you gave us during that time. Thanks on behalf of all the churches you've been a part of, all the clients you've helped, all the colleagues you've supported. 50 years. Wow.
Now let's sing the closing song together.